Welcome to week 5 of the NFL season's wide receiver edition of the Roto Curve podcast between me and Jim here via the video. But before we get started, I want to tell you that we have an NFL trial for our NFL package. What does the package include, you may ask? How about exclusive position rankings, projections, and premium cheat sheets? Must-have DFS tools like DVP ranking, points per attempt, red zone utilization, all the stuff you would need. Optimized DFS lineups for both DraftKings and FanDuel, access to player ownership percentage, and things of the sort. And let me give you the image really quickly while I can. Here we go. We got optimized DFS lineups and tools at rotocurve.com/NFL-trial. I will leave this up for one more beautiful second so you can write it down. Now back to my face for all of you. I apologize. I know the graphic was much better. Jim, let's talk about wide receivers this week. There are a ton of them. We already discussed Brady, so why don't we start with his receiving options? Do we have to use Julian Edelman in cash?
The floor is really high when you look at it. It's incredibly high. And I remember just looking at the leaderboard now, I just had like a flashback to last year when I remember there was a point, maybe it was like week 4 or 5, that Edelman was like the second or third most expensive receiver on the market. There were times when he was getting up into, the 8,000, 8,500 plus range. And that really was just based on his share of the volume, right? He was getting, 9 to 11 targets most outings, and he's super efficient. He's going to haul in 7 of those. He's got a ton of yak to his game. And, it's just like you can just imagine like how many Snapchats he sent Brady over the last 2 weeks. He's in love with the guy. They have a great working relationship. So yeah, the floor is really high. He is a guy that I like in cash basically because of his floor. I mean, that's what I'm looking for in cash, is a guy who I know is going to get me a certain amount of usage and a certain amount of production, and that's what he is. Edelman's bankable. Pivoting off of him, kind of like the more expensive version of Edelman, already fulfilling that role, will be Jarvis Landry, another cash guy that I like. I'm on him often, but he's got 34.1% of the Miami targets. That's second only to Emmanuel Sanders' share in Denver in terms of the percentage of team targets. He's just consuming so much, and Tennessee ranks 30th in pass coverage on Pro Football Focus. They're exploitable in every possession, especially safety. So if he's working the slot routes and gets a nickel corner or a safety on him, he's in a great position. So, I mean, I think those two guys are pretty similar for me in terms of their roles. And obviously Edelman might even get the edge just because he's got the obviously better quarterback. And he might even have the better matchup because Tremont Williams is banged up too. Tremont Williams is banged up. So we're going to be going even deeper into the Cleveland secondary, which is inviting. I like both those guys. I also like Brandon Marshall. You mentioned how you like Ryan Fitzpatrick a good deal in terms of just as a pivot, a cheap pivot, a guy who might trend pass heavy. They're dogs on the road in a game with a high over-under, which means they're going to have to pass. The Steelers are pretty solid against the run. Hayward and Tuitt are pretty good against stuffing the run. So I just think there's a situation here where Marshall with Decker out is going to get 12 plus targets, like a really, really high target share. And, we saw last week, he is a red zone maven still. He did that against a good corner. And I just think, you're going to see a lot of volume here. So it's a volume play. And if you wanted to stack those two guys, it's something we can discuss later, but I think that makes sense.
Yeah, you know what? I'm building around a nice core of receivers this week. You covered a few of them. First, I want to give you a statistic on Edelman. We gave you the split stat in the quarterback video. Well, here's Edelman since 2013 in games where the Patriots are favored by 10 or more. We already saw Brady's numbers go down, but Edelman's go up. I mean, 5 games where they've been favored during that span. He's averaged 18.3 PPR points, 8.4 receptions out of the split, which is 38 games, 15.6, so nearly 3 fantasy points less, 6.18, so nearly almost 1.5 receptions less per game when they're not favored by this. So when they are favored like this, Edelman gets looked for a lot. And I just went on to DraftKings because you mentioned Brandon Marshall. We always mention Antonio Brown at home, and I wanted to see if you could fit this. I've got a lineup with Fitzpatrick. I already mentioned McKinnon was my running back. And if you could go Antonio Brown, Marshall, Edelman, and Jordy Nelson, you can actually still fit a lineup if you're willing to sacrifice Jordan Howard. So I think that is certainly going to interest me this week. Um, I I think that's, receivers are usually the way I like to go in cash games because of the high floor with receptions. Otherwise, I'll use some receiving backs and things like that. But I think that's a very interesting proposition this week. Brandon Marshall is a guy that I love this week against Pittsburgh. I mentioned that, I think they'll be playing from behind. So if you're going to use Fitzpatrick in cash to fit all the other guys around, you might as well use Marshall and go all in on that situation. I don't think there's really much downside to that with Fitzpatrick near minimum price. And Jordy Nelson is the other guy that I kind of threw in there in this four wide receiver core that I like for cash games this week. I mentioned Aaron Rodgers as a tournament guy, but I like, Jordy Nelson for all formats. He's averaging 21 and a half fantasy points so far this year. Antonio Brown, by comparison, 23.7. So he's right there with them, and he's $2,000 cheaper basically at home, where Rodgers always is better. None of these corners on the Giants really scare me. So I think Jordy Nelson is the other guy I got for cash. If you could fit those four guys, I think even some of them are cheaper on FanDuel. I think that's a strategy that I'm got to consider. I love me some Jordan Howard, but man, that's a whole lot of floor for cash, Jim.
That's a lot of targets.
Yeah, that's a whole lot of floor for cash. I don't think you can go wrong there. Let's go to tournaments now because we got kind of four guys that we'd like for cash. Unless you want to talk about anyone else for cash games, why don't I open that up to you first? Is there anyone else?
No, that pretty much covered it. I mean, I was looking at AJ Green, just trying to look for guys with their target share to pivot off of the super high end guys, but he's in that tier now in terms of pricing. And it's one of these things like we talked about Edelman's price last year, Marshall's price last year. I think you're getting a chance to get a guy like that with Marshall in terms of that super dominant target share guy, the kind of why we're attracted, the kind of the only show in town kind of thing. And that's why we're attracted to AJ so much, so I'm not really as interested in him because of the fact that Marshall stands out so much to me. Pittsburgh, just to continue on that, has given up the most receiving yards per game over the last year. So they're not, in the way at all of his production.
Yeah, and the only other guy that was on the outskirts, and now I'm playing around with the lineup as we're doing this video, is Jordan Matthews. I mentioned I like Wentz as a cash quarterback if you could fit it, but he's significantly cheaper than Nelson, and I think he's kind of this year's Eric Decker, where we've seen pretty solid production from him. He scored twice, and the other game he had 70 yards. Well, guess what? Last year, Decker, every game, 70 yards or a touchdown. And I think Wentz doesn't really have that much. I do think Dorial Green-Beckham's going to start, going up the ranks and probably earn the second most targets of any receiver on this team when all said and done. I like Ertz. I like Sproles. But I think Matthews is a guy that they have to get the ball to on a weekly basis. This Detroit team really doesn't scare me. I don't think Slay's going to slow him down, especially on the road in the dome, which is conducive to the offense. So I think you could say that again.
He works so many reps from the slot. I mean, even if Slay, it's usually not beneficial for a guy to be out of position like that. So
right, and he doesn't do that most of the time anyways. So if you go Matthews to Nelson and kind of the idea that I had, you could fit everything you want, which is quite the enticing proposition. But let's go to tournaments. We'll start with Jordan Matthews there because he's certainly viable in a game where I think Philly's going to score a lot. Who else do you like in tournaments?
All right, in tournaments, I'm back on the Deshaun Jackson train. I was on him last week, but I mean, he's the kind of guy that you have to stick with in terms of a tournament target. His price is down. Recency bias is going to help us. He's not going to have a very high ownership percentage, I don't believe. I think a lot of the public still looks at Baltimore, and this isn't an insult to the public. I think it's just a reputation-based thing. I think people still look at the name Baltimore and perceive it as a difficult matchup. And even like the indicators will show you because overall they've been okay against receivers, but he's going to probably draw Sharice Wright for a number of reps here. He ranks, I think, 104th out of 114 corners in coverage on Pro Football Focus. And really just the verticality that he brings. I think you're going to see a situation. Last week they got up and didn't really have to take shots downfield. If this is more of a game as the game script kind of flows, being road dogs, I think, you're going to have a little bit more opportunity for him in the passing game. It's not going to be as easy. Because Cousins really did all his work in the first quarter and then kind of relaxed. They went into cruise mode. I don't think that's the case here. The other guy, honestly, another recency bias guy, he's super expensive, but his quarterback's cheaper now, and it's going to be someone I talk about later, but I like Odell Beckham. I mean, it's not like that big of a surprise, but like I said, the Packers only have one cornerback ranked in the top 65 in grading. They're a bottom 10 team in Football Outsiders and Pro Football Focus and pass grading and coverage rather. So I think it's a get right week. I know all the drama is surrounding him, but really outside of the touchdowns, his pace isn't that crazy off of what he's done before. Of course, touchdowns is what drives big games, but I wouldn't be surprised at all if this is a 150-yard, 2-touchdown game. I mean, that's kind of the case with him any week, right? So I don't think the usage pattern change. I don't think anything really changes with him. If anything, they're going to try to get him the ball a little bit more, which is a narrative. But again, kind of like the Deshaun narrative, road dog against a soft secondary.
Yeah, I'm way on Odell Beckham this week against the susceptible Green Bay secondary without Sam Shields, who's still dealing with that concussion. I wrote about it this week that there's kind of a Julio Jones every week, right, where a top receiver is kind of perceived to be playing a decent defense, so people lay off of them, maybe because they've been cold or something like that. But as long as the top receiver is against the defense without, a elite cornerback, maybe a healthy Jason Verrett type, they can go off on any given week. And I think that's the case for Beckham this week when everyone's pretty much given up on him. So I agree with you there. I am way on Odell. I've got him circled for tournaments. But other guys I really like, how about Philip Dorsett against the Bears? When you look at DVOA, I think it's got a lot to do with Kyle Fuller. But the Bears, very good against number one wide receivers, which, I think they're going to focus on T.Y. Hilton. And eventually Philip Dorsett is going to get his. I know last week he did technically get his, but he did it on literally one pass reception, which is kind of why we like Deshaun Jackson, right? Because, he caught a 64-yard touchdown, and I think he could do that in any given week. But I'd like to see more than 3 targets. And I think if the Bears are as tough as Football Outsiders suggests, then maybe he does see more than that this week with T.Y. Hilton kind of getting blanketed. I like both receivers for the Jets this week if they're going to be down. Not only do I like Marshall, I like Quincy Enunwa, who's been seeing a healthy amount of targets. So I think I'm willing to use both, maybe some tournament lineups with Fitzpatrick to Marshall and with Fitzpatrick to Enunwa. And kind of one that I don't feel great about. So this was a tournament. But how about Tavon Austin? With people going with the Brian Quicks, I think people have kind of forgotten that they try and scheme this guy in. And Buffalo is tough on the outside receivers. They've got a pair of solid cornerbacks, or at least they should be if they didn't have Rob Ryan coordinating. But I think speed guys like Tavon Austin are going to give them fits. So it's a long shot play, but I think in terms of the matchup, it makes a ton of sense to me. Otherwise, for tournaments, I'm with you on Deshaun Jackson. I really like Tyrell Williams, and I think it's between him and Inman. So I'm gonna give you the case for both. Last week, it was the second consecutive week that Inman played the most snaps of anyone on this in this wide receiver core. He obviously had a big week. I think he caught 5 of 11 targets for over 100 yards, but he had only been targeted. It was 2 yards a target prior to last week. Yeah. So it kind of came out of nowhere. Whereas Williams has been the guy that's, kind of downfield, and Benjamin's been third in snaps amongst the group. So I think one of these guys is going to go off this week. Oakland is susceptible against the pass, even though they've been a bit better lately. So I'm going to have some tournament shares to both. My gut tells me Inman, but my head tells me Williams. So I'm going to have some shares of each of these guys. But really, that's what I've got for tournaments this week. Did we miss anyone?
Well, yeah, I didn't include Sammy Coates as a guy that I really love in tournaments. They're gonna try to scheme him against Darrelle Revis, I would guess. Another guy who has fallen off. I mean, he's had a great career, but I'm a Pitt alum, so I have a lot of love for Revis Island. But Revis Island is like an all-inclusive now. You want to go to Revis Island, and I just think it's a great situation for Coates, who out-snapped, out-target, out-route, everything. He's averaged Marcus Wheaton, who, at this point, it's not an injury thing, it's a production thing. Marcus Wheaton just isn't very good. He had the touchdown last week, but that was his only target. His only catch, obviously. So I just think the fact that Coates' average depth of target, we're talking about these deep threats already between, guys like Deshaun Jackson. His average depth of target this year is 19.9 yards downfield, which is amazing. It basically just means he's running go routes, but it also means he's with a big armed quarterback against a bad secondary as home favorites. And like you said, Big Ben is almost kind of breezy in the way that he's awesome at home. So I think there's a nice setup here to do a cheap stack there with with Big Ben and Coates. I mean, even if you want to get really aggressive and just load up on them in a tournament kind of situation to see if they go off. So Coates is right. Coates is cheaper than Tavon Austin even. I just think, he could have, 100 yards and 3 catches and make your day for you.
Yeah, just two guys I want to mention that if you're doing 10 lineups, maybe you want exposure in one lineup to each. Bryce Butler is a guy who kind of looked like the number one receiver in Dak Prescott's guy last week. He's a big boy. He's 6'4", so they can target him in the red zone against a Cincinnati defense that's kind of been giving it up to the pass. And Eddie Royal, without Kevin White, I think is their true number 2 target. They face Indy, who's been susceptible against the pass. If Vontae Davis is healthy, he probably focuses on Jeffrey. So I think we get one of those Eddie Royal stretches where he's, fantasy relevant for maybe a few weeks, and he falls off the face of the earth. I think we're still in the middle of a phase where Eddie Royal is relevant. Any other receivers, or did we cover them all?
No, I'm pretty satisfied. I mean, I think we covered a good range of guys you can trust, and then guys who have the high ceilings that, we like to target in tournaments. And I think a blend of these guys can really help you.
There you go. Don't forget the NFL trial. What do you get in it? Position rankings, projections, cheat sheets, DFS tools like DVP rankings, points per attempt, red zone, that sort of good stuff, optimized lineups, which is always nice to double check your lineup with to see if you, are on the beaten path, and access to player ownership percentage. So again, check out rotocurve.com. It is rotocurve.com/NFL-trial. Stay tuned with us. We still got one video for you this week. It is stacks. It is the most important one for tournaments. So stay tuned.